investigator of a project, that a 3-year project where we're creating computational models to study how religion and different people with different beliefs or even secular beliefs can come into conflict with each other, under what conditions they do, under what conditions they lose their beliefs, under what conditions they become more anxious about their beliefs, and those sorts of issues. So, Conrad, maybe you just want to say a little bit more about the details of the project, or more about your unit there at the university.
Okay, well, I mean, the unit is called the Society and Cognition Unit. And basically, the work that we do is at the intersection of cognitive science and sociology. So, looking at the social aspects of cognition or the cognitive aspects of societies. And the project in question is one where we're looking at various aspects of what happens in societies that are undergoing secularization, uh, societies where religion is coming to play less of a significant role.
Amazing. And we're looking forward to hearing more of that. Laron and Conrad, when y'all are talking, if one of you can mute yourselves since you're in the same room. Uh,
Good plan.
but very good. Um, so how kind of bridging out, so we always kind of start talking about religion. So can any of the three of you talk about why the study of religion is important, and how that relates to kind of the rest of life? What understandings bridge beyond that?
Okay, well, I mean, perhaps I'll take that because I suspect you've probably heard Laron talking about much the same stuff beforehand, right? I mean, religion appears to be a it's even hard to know what to call it, a phenomenon, an institution, a mechanism that has organized people throughout human history, essentially, in various ways. Um, and where those ways have had both positive and negative effects, right? Now, it appears that many countries right now are undergoing a very significant change in that respect. I know that Justin's probably not going to agree with me on this one, so I think there's going to be a bit of an interesting conversation here. But basically, religion seems to be playing less and less of a role in many societies, which means that, as per always, really, society is moving into uncharted waters in this respect. So you've got two different fundamental reasons why you want to be interested in this phenomenon. On the one hand, because of the significance, the social significance of religion, and also to be able to predict what the effects, the challenges are going to be of the change in that significance.
So yeah, I to Conrad's point of potential contention that he mentioned is that it, I largely do agree with him because I know I understand the position he's coming from. He and I have hashed this out over many beers over the last 10 years that we've known each other, I guess it's been at this point. Um Oddly enough, never beers in the country in which we both live. We always meet in foreign countries. um so on the one hand, I agree with him. I see what he's saying. But on the other hand, I think that one of the reasons that we see this, and one of the reasons that people are discussing this idea that the world is becoming more secular and less religious, isn't because we're actually becoming less religious. It's because religion is changing. And so the foundation or the measuring stick that we hold up to something and go, hey, is this religion? We look at something and go, is this religion? And we look at, like, a Catholic church and we go, yeah, that's religion. And then we look at Buddhism and we go, yeah, sure, that's religion too. And then we look at a mosque and we go, yeah, that's religion for sure. And then we look at, a person who's doing crystal healing rituals and we go, nah, that's not religion, that's spirituality. And I think that when you look at religion as something that is beliefs in some sort of supernatural power that exists in the universe and that people are doing sort of ritual behaviors about, or justifying ritual behaviors that they do with other people or beliefs they held with other people based on something that's supernatural. When you look at the people doing some sort of crystal ritual or crystal healing, that does qualify as religiosity quite clearly, actually. Um, it's just that it's a form of religiosity that's kind of so foreign or so new to us that our definition of religion is based on this paradigm of Christianity, and it doesn't really hold up well. I mean, you've got your Christian religions, and then you have your sort of pagan religions, and people say tribal religions, but nobody has, you know, kooky hippies with their crystals. They just kind of say this is New Age, and the fact is that that's just as legitimate as a religious belief as any other, but we don't have a good measure for it. So in the Czech Republic and Norway, which are these bastions of secularity, when you force someone to tick a box on a survey, the Czech Republic has like one of the fastest growing UFO religions in the world, and they worship these aliens that come from the Pleiades, and you can channel these aliens into your body. And if this is not a kind of weird new religion, then I don't know what it is. And in Norway, even members of the royal family have like their own crystal cult, basically, and they're they're very much proselytizing for the power of crystals in the way that they can heal. And I mean, this is obviously a supernatural belief in this typical sense of the world, as geologists have not documented any such power in a rock to date.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's kind of like, yes, but also we're not really less religious. It's just that religion is shifting with us in a way that scholarship can't keep up with. Religion is moving faster than academia. This seems to be what's really happening.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I kind of knew that Justin would reply that way.
Oh
I
yeah, I
mean,
had to throw the punch.
yeah, of course. You know, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right that people give a particular interpretation of the word religion because of the social context we find ourselves in, where, for most people in the Western world, the social context is that of Christianity, right? So when people think religion, people think Christianity. But I think that actually it works for my point, the way that I've been using the word, right? Because that is undergoing just disappearance, essentially, in most societies in the West, right? Now, of
With
course,
rich white people.
rich white people, yes,
With rich white people.
with educated, industrialized
Yeah,
rich
and
white
those
brothers.
people, yeah, Christianity is, that's their parents' religion. They don't want that.
Yeah,
They want something new and exotic. But in places like South America and Africa and
absolutely,
Southeast
absolutely.
Asia,
Sure, sure, sure.
charismatic Christianity and Pentecostal Christianity,
Absolutely.
your good
Right.
old time religion with your tent revivals, that stuff's spreading
But,
like wildfire.
but, right? I think there's more to be said here, right? I don't want to just straight out disagree with what you said, that supernatural beliefs and in that sense religions hang around. They don't, they don't hang around, because I think there is very good reason for thinking that. I mean, the fundamental thing being, these kinds of beliefs, these kinds of practices seem to be coming pretty deeply out of the makeup of human minds. Um, so, absolutely. But of course, my favorite go-to phrase is that, human phenotype. So, the traits we actually have is always the end result of an interaction between the genotype, the genes we have, and the environment, right? So, just because it's written deeply into a genetic, biological, mental makeup doesn't mean that always has to come out, right? You change the environment, you change that, right?
Yeah.
And the environment is changing massively.
When you have an environment that's so safe that it's basically boring, like
Exactly.
Norway. I mean, what's even what's
I,
it, like the most
don't
dangerous
not
animal in
Norway. I'm
Norway
in
besides
Norway right
people
now,
is
and I
what?
like it.
Reindeer?
I like Norway. This is a good place.
Yeah, yeah, but it's a great example, right? Like the social safety net in Norway is is so high, the general levels of predation and infection and
Hmm.
disease are so low that a lot of the things that we usually need to have a social group to circle the wagons for, just people in Norway don't care about it. I mean, even finding a job, people don't
And
care about that in
and
Norway.
strangely
So,
enough, one of the models that we're working on is exactly about that, right? Basically, one of the models that we're working on works on the assumption that religion has been a motivator of prosocial behavior, of cooperation with others in our in-group, and that it itself has been driven by anxiety of all sort, which has been driven by threats.
mhm,
So you essentially get this kind of situation where you've got a feedback, a negative feedback, that if you get too many threats, you get religion going up, and then you get cooperation, which drives down the threats because you have a well-running
mhm.
society. But once the threats go down, the religion goes down, and the threats go up.
It's like an oscillator system.
It's yeah, and we've had that, and now of course we're about to introduce central institutions, which by outside means ensure high level of cooperation, and see what effect that has on religiosity. Right. So exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about. But just going back earlier to what you said about different aspects of religion and how we focus on certain ones, certain of them. Right. We've also been doing work on analysis of large scale surveys, international surveys, like the European Social Survey, European Values Survey, and so forth, where they ask typically the kinds of questions like, do you attend church? Do you pray at home? Do you identify as a particular religion? Do you have supernatural beliefs of some sort, etc., etc., etc. Right. And what we found is that there's a very clear pattern in how these kinds of aspects of religiosity drop off, right? And what we found is essentially the first thing to disappear is, well, the one that's the most work intensive. It's the one that's actually going to church,
Mm. Putting the
right?
time and effort in.
Putting the time and effort into going to church. So you get, across generations, seeing that dip down, and then a generation or two later, you see dipping down of prayer, private prayer.
Actual belief.
Then hold on, we haven't got to that yet. Then after that, you get a dip in affiliation, which of course is a very big one for Christianity, right? That's a very important thing. It's many people the measure, right?
Mm.
But that comes and dips a generation or two after that. Right. Now, the question really about what you've been saying is, do we then see a generation or two after that a dip in supernatural beliefs? And I think that's really an open question because we just haven't been following the process for long enough.
Mhm.
Right. Now, what seems to me to suggest that it may actually happen, that even supernatural beliefs in general will disappear, is that at the very least you're definitely seeing something like an atrophying of complexity of supernatural beliefs, right? If you think about the sort of folk supernatural beliefs that you have in more traditional societies, I mean even in Europe, like 17th 16th century, this was a very complex world that people were thinking about, even in the context of superstitions, right? These days, in the context of superstitions, what do people think about? It's luck. It's good luck. It's bad luck. Become reduced to something very, very simple. The ontology is, very much simplified.
Mm.
So I suppose when it comes to that very question, I'm open-minded. That's one thing. And the second thing is that if we're interested about the social impact of religion, if we're interested about the role that religion plays in society in motivating people to cooperate with each other or against each other, right, which is the other side of this thing always, that's not the thing that's important. It's the stuff that goes before that, goes away before that, that's important, right? So I suppose also to a certain degree, what I would call religion would really depend on the context and on the audience that I'm talking to.
Hmm.
Yeah, different variables. Conrad, do you mind muting when oh, thanks.
Hmm.
So we do have evidence that at least in lots of countries, there is a dip in belief in God and somewhat of but a much slower belief in supernatural agency in general, like the crystals and so forth. But there are two other thoughts that we might go down either of these two bunny trails if they sound interesting. Um, when you started describing the model, Conrad, that the pro-sociality model, or the it's really about altruism in groups, and the threats and the anxiety, I immediately thought of Brian. Often when Brian hears us describe these artificial societies, and we talk about making our artificial agents, anxious, threatening them, they come into conflict, and then so we end their lives and start the simulation over again. Brian also often says, "Okay, now this is ethical. Why? What's their experience?" So it might be fun. I actually love to hear your reflections on that, Conrad. But the other bunny trail we might explore is in relationship to the current Ukraine crisis, when refugees come across the Polish border and they believe in Allah, and their skin is brown and so forth, then they react one way. But whereas when they're Christian,
Then
they
they're
react a
turned
different way.
away.
So the whole point about beliefs have real world under stress, under anxiety and threat, they have real world impact. So I'll mute and
Okay, yeah. Let's talk about that second topic, if it's okay, right? Because
Go for it.
it's something that's really been not even at the forefront of my mind. It's been at the forefront of my life,
How
right?
far is Bialystok from the border?
It's
To give a context of how close you are to this.
well, I don't live in Białystok, right?
Yeah.
The Białystok is about 50 kilometers from the border, but it's from Belarusian border. I
Yeah.
live just outside of Warsaw,
Hmm.
and Warsaw Central Station has been essentially the main processing center for the refugees from Ukraine.
Yeah.
In the last month, the population of Poland is, I think, in the order of about 36, 35 million people. In the last month, that has increased by 2 million,
Hmm.
right? Basically 5%. The little town outside of Warsaw that I live in is a town of about 13,000 people. Except in the last month, it's taken in about 1,300 refugees, 10% of the population,
Yeah.
right? You go anywhere in Poland, you go to the shops, you go on the train, and you hear Ukrainian everywhere.
Hmm.
And it's always the same picture. It's women with children, women with children, women with children,
Yeah.
women with children.
Because the men aren't leaving the country.
Because the
They're
men are not
conscripted.
leaving the country because they're conscripted. Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. So the thing that's been getting me is for the last half a year or so, we've had the Belarusian dictator pushing people from Syria, from Afghanistan, from other places in Asia and the Middle East, over the border into Poland. And the response of the Polish government to that has been to say, well, they're illegal immigrants, so we're going to push them back over the border into Ukraine, which means that the Polish border guards are taking families, because they're usually also families. I mean, they're sometimes young men, but it doesn't matter, right? And pushing them, no matter what the condition is, no matter for the reason for coming here, because nobody asks them. Nobody asks them why they're here, right? The question is not being investigated. Everybody is being pushed across the border, Belarus, which means pushing them into the forest, in the middle of winter, which is essentially torture and murder.
Yeah.
Right? And that
Russian
is
soldiers aren't doing too well in the winter out there. I can't imagine what a refugee without
exactly,
anything
right,
to put over their head.
right. And I mean, this is treatment which is so fundamentally inhumane that it is unbelievable to me. It is profoundly shaming to me that my own society is involved in that kind of behavior,
Mhm.
right? And here's the thing. Laurent said, well, it's because the Muslims, it's because they're a different color skin. It may well be the second, but I do not think it is the first, because nobody's asking them their religion, and certainly at least some of them are Catholics.
Mhm.
Or sorry,
Yeah.
not Catholics, Christians, obviously not Catholics, right, from that part of the world, but Christians.
Is there any or what knowledge do you have? Let me put it this way, right? Because there's probably not any data, but what knowledge do you have of the Roma or gypsies from the Ukraine who would be coming into Poland, right? Because on the face of it, they look darker, like someone who would be Middle
Hmm.
Eastern in many cases. But from a religious standpoint, they're a heavily Christian and Catholic community. So that would be an interesting use case, right, for that,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they
Well,
also they don't share the Orthodox religion that most of the Ukrainians and Russians also share, right? So religion's not really the factor of the conflict there. They share that religious that religious belief. But then there's also that group where in the Venn diagram you kind of hit the yeah, this is about skin color situation from an evidence standpoint.
um, well, I mean, first, in the context of what's happening with the Ukrainians and what the reaction is to the Ukrainians, right? As I said, 5% of the population. One of the arguments of the government against these refugees across the Belarusian border was, we can't take in so many refugees. There've been like 2,000, 3,000, maybe 4,000.
Hmm.
I don't know how many thousands. The information is very tightly controlled.
But it was thousands,
It was thousands,
not
not
millions.
millions in a month.
Yeah,
And the reaction to the Ukrainians,
has been.
literally every single person I know is helping somehow. Everybody, right? I mean, to make it clear, my ex-wife, who I always thought was profoundly self-interested, is helping to teach them Polish.
Mhm.
Right? She speaks Russian, right? So she's helping to teach them Polish.
Yeah, here actually one of the guys who comes in on this live feed often, Pavel Koznach, he's opened his house. He's taken in a refugee family here, and he's
Yep.
currently in Kiev as a UN observer and working with a Red Cross mission to bring supplies to Kiev right now. So he's been there, and he'll be there for the next for the next week before he comes back to Bratislava if all goes well.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and here's as well. Like I just walking down the street today, I saw a sign with a Ukrainian flag, and
Yep.
in English, Slovak, and Ukrainian, the sign reads, Ukrainians welcome free soup. So
Yeah.
like a lot of the
You see
restaurants and stuff
Ukrainian
are giving
flags
free
everywhere in
food.
Poland.
Yeah,
You see
yeah,
Ukrainian flags everywhere in Poland.
yeah,
There is just a massive, and it's very much bottom up
yeah.
action to help these people, because the Polish government has done bugger all.
Yeah. So
Right?
what's interesting though, right, is that because it's not a top-down situation, and it's not a top-down situation in Slovakia either,
Hmm.
or the Czech Republic, but the response has very much been the same. It's been an outpouring of not just support, but also like energy. Like people are just hashtagging, right? People are teaching them Polish, they're teaching them Slovak, they're giving them their homes, right?
Yes.
Literally giving them their homes.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that it seems that something has happened, right? And in a lot of the work that simulates cooperation and conflict, people take kind of two strategies. On the one strategy, there's the game theoretic strategy, which I've made no secret that I think is bullshit. And the other strategy, which is more along the multi-agent AI strategy, which is more like what you're doing in Bialystok, what Laurent's been doing in Norway, what we've been doing, on all of our projects as well, that kind of looks at the idea that the human mind is processing information in more complex ways than game theory could
Of
possibly
course.
capture. And one of those interesting spaces where the game theoretic comes up against this multi-agent AI, or this cognitive approach, if you will, is the cooperation and competition literature, right? Because the competition and the game theory literature would say, you know, you're forced with a stranger who wants to take the most prized possession you have and the key aspect of the wealth of your family. Would you share it with them, knowing that they have nothing, and they have every incentive to take those resources from you from a purely economic and rational perspective? And the answer is no, I will not cooperate. I'm not going to lend them my home because I have a home and they need a home. So would they not try and kick me out or steal something from me? So the game theoretic perspective, which is just cold in its calculations in a way, would suggest that you don't want to cooperate. But what we see is that that's obviously yet again another failure of game theory from a decision prediction standpoint, and that we do see this outpouring of support because it seems that in certain cases, and this gets back to your point of why they're cooperating with certain people and not others. In certain cases, there is a foundation of mutual identification with certain others, but not certain other others, where they're saying, no, I see myself in these people. I'm identifying with them. The information signals I'm getting from them suggests that I could be them.
And
And I know that, like, the 1968 invasion, right, where the Russians blew tanks all the way through to Prague, is very salient in the minds of people in Czechoslovakia today. I assume it's probably come up in Polish conversation as well. Um,
absolutely,
that there is a bit of an identification with the Ukrainian situation of, like, if we don't stop them in Kiev, then they're gonna come for us too.
yes.
And so there's an interesting shared history, but there's obviously something more than that, right? From your
Mhm.
examples, right, which are well documented, that there's also this aspect of, like, that goes deeper than language, and it's this idea that it seems to be related to things like, oh, well, these Ukrainians are the Ukrainians we want, and these others are Ukrainians that we don't want.
Well, I mean, with the Ukrainian situation, I mean, the difference between that and the treatment on the Belarusian border makes me think, actually, because this doesn't seem to be religiously driven, right? The decision whether we're going to think of these people as people who are members of our in group,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, that seems to me that it's symbolic of Poland's secularization, actually, of how far secularization has come in Poland.
Interesting. So in this case, sort of that secularization model is suggesting that the secularization is, it's getting rid of a potential identity marker where it could create identification that would make some of the other refugees
Look,
feel like in-group members when they're not
historically,
otherwise.
for Polish Catholics, the Orthodox were very much the outgroup, very much the outgroup.
Hmm.
It was, in fact, the contextually relevant outgroup. The
Hmm.
Orthodox and the Jews,
Hmm.
right? Those were the two contextually relevant outgroups.
And my understanding is there's actually been an overall positive reception to Ukrainian Jews leaving for Poland, because they have their own networks at the border, and so they kind of cross the border into Poland. They can
I
find their folks, and they kind of just go on
I
further.
haven't actually, in the Polish discussions, I have not seen any discussions of Jews, right?
Mm,
I've barely seen any discussions of any kind of refugee from Ukraine than ethnic Ukrainians. Right?
mhm,
It just seems like all of those issues, like with the Roma, with Jews, you've had Jewish communities in Ukraine for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So that's a ridiculous kind of distinctions in many ways.
mhm.
But the more obvious distinction, the Indian students who were used to be studying in Ukraine.
Yeah.
My feeling is that just this stuff just gets lost in the enormous flood of people, right? Now the fact that uh, they have been accepted as clearly members of the in group I think you're absolutely right that part of that is that they're facing a a threat that is highly relevant to Poland, right? As you said, if we don't stop them in Kiev, they'll come to Białystok and Warsaw. Exactly. I think that's something that's in the back of the minds of most people in Poland.
Mhm.
So that in effect, by helping the Ukrainians, we're helping ourselves. But
Mm.
I think that's definitely just one aspect of it. And I'm far from understanding why it is that there is such a profoundly different way of treating one one kind of refugee from the other kind of refugee. I mean, obviously, it has something to do with how you identify your in group,
Mhm.
but that's not really saying much.
It's almost like it would be an interesting computational experiment to use some of the simulations we have of identity structures to figure out how you could trigger false positives for the benefit of taking in refugees. Because I think you also see this not just in the Ukraine. I mean, we saw this in Syria too, like the work Laurent and I were doing in Lesbos. We very much saw the same dynamic of the Syrians coming to Greece, and then they're in the EU. So then where do they go? And that. I think had that had reverberations all the way up to Brexit. I mean, that was something that was heavily in the media regarding the decision for Britain to leave the European Union. You see, I think something very similar in the United States as well, with a lot of people coming from different countries in South and Central America that should legitimately be considered refugees when they're leaving countries like Venezuela, for example. And that in some instances, they see Cubans as refugees that are like legitimate and welcomed in many places. You think of the South typically as like this standoffish white culture, but then you go down to like Florida and you see you know rednecks going into Cuban bars and having a great time, sort of a thing, because there's this kind of a shared identification there. And then, of course, when they look though at the new immigrant from South America, they don't share that identification. They can obviously extend it to the Cuban, but they can't so easily extend it to the Venezuelan. And it seems like it's largely out of ignorance of the situation, because the reason that Cuban came to America is probably the exact same reason that Venezuelan came to America. And had they known that,
Yeah, yeah.
there might be a way of triggering those that false positive of the system to say, no, this guy is in my in group. And maybe once they talk, they realize that they're not in the same in group, but at that point it's too late. The conversation has been had, they were initially accepted. So the idea would be interesting to explore the extent to which some of these models could allow for people to kind of default welcome with open arms, and then decide if you want to have a beer with them later, because you
Yeah,
don't have to have a beer with every refugee. You don't even have to like them. Just
help them.
give them, yeah, help them find a safe place to hang their hat, and then you go on about your life, and you're never going to talk to them again if you don't want to. Or God forbid you make a friend. Like, there's all sorts of options, but the best option is like, first we need to find a safe place for these people.
Sorry, Laurent. Just one more thing, if I can just say, like this, really makes me think of the stories about how Black Americans used to use, essentially dressing up as Indians
Mm.
to then appear to be outside of that,
Outside of the
black and
paradigm.
white paradigm, and therefore much more accepted. Uh, yeah. Sorry, Laurent, you wanted to say something.
Justin's comment about using some of the models we have to see under what conditions, or how in the models we might get people to have the false positives. It made me think again of the Brian question: are we manipulating our simulated agents into letting in more immigrants than they really want to? But I also wanted to mention there is kind of a rumor going around that the Research Council of Norway may have an emergency call on research related to Ukrainian refugees, and if they did, then we could be ready to jump in and try to put a proposal together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could just kind of copy and paste a lot of the code that we used in Northern Ireland, the stuff that we're doing with Cambridge University right now, and Kitty O'Loon and that project on trying to understand in-group and out-group dynamics there. The work that we're doing in the Balkans is particularly relevant as well, and kind of copy and paste, fork that code over, and try and build something that could potentially be useful there, building off of what we're doing in Cambridge and what we're doing or what we did in Lesbos.
Another thing to do with identifying in groups and out groups. This is a point that Justin, I'm sure, is going to appreciate.
Something
Some
good's
of
coming.
this is good. You like this.
Something's good's coming if you premise it that way.
Some of the discussions that I've been having on Facebook with some of my friends have been with friends of mine whose general political outlook is pretty much similar to mine, so broadly speaking, left wing, but whose cultural context is, for example, places like Spain, and who are much more willing to take the viewpoint of Putin and say, NATO has done lots of negative things. American foreign policy is highly problematic, etc., 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 etc. And my reaction, living, on the other side of the border from Ukraine, is, what the hell are you guys smoking?
Yes.
Right? You want me to talk about the problems of American foreign policy? I can
all
do that
day
for
long.
hours. I can do it all day. Not today. Not now. This is not the topic of conversation right now. This is not the problem we have right now. Right now, we're dealing with a bastard who is destroying a country.
Yeah, and I mean,
And
and I'm even say like, sure, walk and chew gum at the same time if you want, but keep in mind what's really happening. Like, what I find problematic is that I think a lot of people are doing that because they want to shift the narrative of the conversation because they're uncomfortable with where they stand. They don't want to come out and say, yeah, this is what's up. And I think part of it is because they want to have their cake and eat it too. They're looking a lot of people are just looking to score political points in a game where nobody wins and nobody cares. Nobody's watching. Nobody gives a shit
well,
about what somebody's opinion is, and like, oh well, I don't, I kind of think that Putin has a point when he says that there's foreign policy. Like, yeah, there is, but look who you're agreeing with right now. Like, is that where you're gonna stand? Is that where you stand? Like, and then all of a sudden, well, no, I don't, and it's like, then shut up and get in line.
well, I'm actually going to take the side of my left wing, Spanish friends here and say, well, I'm sure that you have lots of people in NATO, in the United States, who are right now spending serious time on figuring out how to use what's happening right now as propaganda. Right?
Not that
But
hard.
I
Sometimes
don't
the facts
care.
just speak for
That is
themselves.
not what I care about right now.
Yeah,
That is
I
not
mean,
the
if we're being
problem.
honest, like, just the raw video feeds from any satellite in the world, no matter who owns it right now, is the greatest propaganda that NATO has ever had. Ever.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ever. It has never looked worse for Russia, and
Yes.
NATO has never looked more needed in the history of the organization.
Absolutely.
And, all the war games models that they've relied on in the past of like, oh, well, this model suggests that Putin might do this or he might do that. It's never been more clear that NATO is needed. And people go, oh, that's propaganda. It's like, just because the facts highly favor one argument doesn't make it propaganda. It means that it's a clear decision. And people, I think, are uncomfortable in a clear decision in what's become a post fact world on social media because they get to just spread whatever bullshit they want. So long as enough people click like on it, they feel as if they're justified in holding the most abhorrent of views. And I think that this is a perfect example because we have this massive misinformation campaign where people who are otherwise, not even otherwise, people who are objectively extremely intelligent are making Putin's arguments for him and then justifying these orthogonal beliefs that they brought to the table that may or may not even be true based on the idea of like, oh, well, this is just NATO propaganda. It's like, no, you need to look at it objectively and you see that actually maybe NATO had a point all along. The question is, why are you, not you, but you, the
Yeah.
royal you, so uncomfortable with admitting that?
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes people really uncomfortable. And that's one of the things that's kind of at the forefront of modeling identity in conversations that we're like, we have not yet cracked that nut. We're looking at that. But there's that cognitive dissonance between sort of, from the computer, the mathematical standpoint, right? My prior, in a Bayesian sense, my prior belief that I brought to the table, and then this overwhelming amount of evidence that I've taken, it shows that it's not purely a Bayesian calculation. Because at this point, if it were purely Bayesian, pretty much everybody would be pro NATO right now. But the fact is that that information that they get is not internalized equally. The frequency count of importance and what changes the emotion in someone's mind computationally is not equal just because their prior belief was further away from a pro NATO stance than before. So for some people, incorporating that information is attaching itself, it seems, to other sort of like totemic ideological markers that are critical to their identity, where NATO is kind of just the topic of conversation that they're applying their ideology to. It's not that it's actually shifted their belief, because all of this overwhelming evidence isn't really relevant to them. It's just relevant to a conversation that they're having on social media. And that, I think, is like, that's a distinction that if we can figure out how to crack that mathematically, could be critical in understanding how to potentially shift beliefs in a post-integrative society. Because the next question that Poland needs to ask is, there's 2 million refugees now. There might be 4 million by the time this is done.
Yeah.
How many of those 4 million are going to go back? Where are they going to go back? If they're from Mariupol, that city's leveled. The Russians destroyed that city. It's rubble. They're not going back. They're going to stay in Poland. And then what's Poland going to do? And these are the questions that are kind of 2 steps forward that I think modeling and simulation is such a beautiful tool to help with from a policy perspective that needs to be considered. But people haven't yet considered it yet because they're still kind of flying by the seat of their pants. And I also understand, right, because I do have an interesting perspective into how the policy making happens here in a sense, that they have an immediate issue. They're not worried about the guys from the ivory tower saying, hey, we got a computer model over here. They're just like, fuck off, we got an issue to deal with. So we have to figure out a way of marketing this, basically, and engaging with them from a value proposition and saying, look, we get it, you're busy, just let us do what we're going to do and come back to you and do this. So that's why I'm really excited, Laurent, that you mentioned that the Norwegian government might be funding some work on this, because I think that's a perfect example of Norwegians have money to burn. Give me some of that oil money. We'll help.
Doing work that's interesting and valuable. I like
Mhm.
the idea.
Yeah, right? It's so rare. Giggle Dragon showed up. We didn't even have to say cryptocurrency 3 times. Not yet. Now we're already 1 down. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Laurent, you want to say something?
Cryptocurrency.
Cryptocurrency.
There we go. It's happened.
Giggle Dragon's here.
It's like the Sheldon knock. If you watch Big Bang Theory, even if somebody opens the door, he still has to knock 3 times, or else nobody knows what to do.
Amazing. Well,
Wow.
thank you so much for joining. And yeah, it's always interesting to hear this, and then there's always kind of never an ending to the conversation. And that's kind of, I think, the thing that's most appreciated is that it's an ongoing conversation, because there's so much nuance in everything that's being discussed. And it seems consistently like the answer at the end of all these conversations is to keep having the conversation, and keep welcoming more people into the conversation. So that is what we're going to do next week, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, at the next Practicing Safe Sex.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for
Cheers.
joining us, Conrad. Laurent, thank you so much for inviting him. Super excited to read a bit more into the paper that you two have been working on. And excited to have you back and continue this conversation.
Yeah, nicely done.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the DeepMind paper that we were going to talk about.
Well, that's true.
I'm
About
curious.
DeepMind.
I have a question. So you talked about like the marginalized refugees. Like where are the safe places for them? Like what is kind of the opportunities for them at this time?
In Poland,
In Poland or elsewhere, like if they're not being welcomed there, if the resources and the community is not welcoming for them there, like what other options do they have available?
in Poland, you have small groups of volunteers who actually being criminalized for helping these people.
Wow.
But
Interesting.
essentially, the safe place in Poland for these refugees is across the German border.
Yeah. Or in Slovakia, it seems, because in Slovakia, I mean, all the countries here, their response is largely run by small groups of volunteers, and particularly when you're looking at any marginalized or minority communities, even like the Jewish communities, for example, it's largely even Jehovah's Witnesses, like it's largely other other people from their group are flying in from sometimes all over the world to the border groups to help out. In Slovakia, they're not being criminalized, though, is one thing. And what may be an interesting dynamic, I don't know if this is the case in Poland, because I'm not very familiar as much, or I'm not as familiar with Poland. In Slovakia, the policy is if you have a Ukrainian passport, you can come and you can ride the rails for free. You'll get your support that you need, and you can you can cross the border, and they'll get you at least. Basically, you can get as far as Bratislava without a problem, but there's also buses that will take you as far as the Czech Republic as well, just because Slovakia is a small country. Slovakia, for example, is 5 million, so it's a fraction of the size of Poland, both geographically and by population, but we've also taken a proportionate fraction of the refugees. We haven't taken as many as Poland has. But one of the things that's an interesting sort of like human geography thing that I think attenuates that is that a lot of the biggest marginalized community in this equation, in at least from the Slovak standpoint, are the Roma. And most of the largest Roma communities and Roma settlements happen to be close to the Ukrainian border. So if it comes to they're coming over and they're looking for a community that's obviously going to be accepting, a lot of them are going to have ties there, but of course the thing is it depends on which of the Roma tribal communities that they're part of, because it is a very tribalistic sort of demarcation of which group you're in. So you're going to want to find they're going to want to find that, but there are resources that are becoming available. It's just that it's one of these things, and the thing that frustrates me the most about this is that so much of this is too little too late, when people have been trying to sound the alarm about these issues, not just from like a marginalized community standpoint, but even from a security standpoint for years. And there was just no movement from the European Union on this. And it's incredibly frustrating that like Laurent and I went to Brussels in 2019, right before COVID broke out, basically, and we gave an address to like the Director General's office was there, with the Joint Research Council, the European Commission was there. We had a lot of people, most of the religious communities from Brussels that are represented at the European Union level came as well. So we had a great, interesting group of people, led to follow-up conversations with the European Commission, and it was like, look, we know that the Syria situation was one issue, and we know that there's going to be another one. It's a matter of time, because between geopolitical issues like Russia and climate change issues that are going to lead to major things like natural disasters, we know that there's going to be another refugee issue, and you should be ready for it now. And they basically said, we agree, but political pressure, and they stopped moving forward on that. And so it was definitely it's really frustrating, I think, from that standpoint. That's what really gets me the most and pisses me off the most. This is like, people told them that this was going to happen, and they didn't prepare. And so a lot of the strife, I think, and the feelings that people have right now from the Ukrainian side as well, like, we could have helped by being prepared, and we weren't preparing for this. And that, I think, is the travesty that people are just not going to want to talk about. When this dust settles, they're going to be like, oh, pat yourself on the back, your country took X refugees, congratulations, you get a hashtag. And it's like, fuck off.
I gotta tell you guys a story. I've told this story already to Laurent.
The
Right.
border is open.
At Warsaw Central
People are
Station,
able to
as I said,
escape.
it's one of the main transfer points.
But
It was described to me, by the way, as a refugee
There's different types
encampment,
of
basically.
people,
Well, it's not an encampment.
Like
There are
the
no
upper floor of
encampments.
it is like,
and the
They're
surrounding
there,
countries,
Blanket.
such as
they're there
Poland,
for hours or a couple of days,
welcoming
and then they move on to
the
people's houses.
people differently.
Right. It's amazing, like that there are no encampments essentially, right?
Putin can have
Despite
too
the
many
number
days,
of
right?
people. But the local government representative for the Warsaw region put up a great big banner saying, the Warsaw region is helping Ukrainians. And he was criticized by one of the main organizers of the effort, the rescue, the relief effort. And he sent her an email saying, "You're fired." And she just laughed. And she said, "Okay, you clearly don't understand. I'm a volunteer. I'm not hired by you.
I don't
doing
work
this
for
out of my own goodwill. The only reason why I'm in the position of being the organizer is because I turned up and somebody had to be the organizer, and it happened to be me. You have nothing to say here. Piss off."
Yes. And thus, the clash between centralized systems and bureaucracy and decentralized systems. A decentralized system will always win, because what's he going to do? He's going to fire you.
Okay,
that mechanism is irrelevant. You can't fire him. I love it.
think that's the case, but it's definitely the case here, that you've got an amazing amount of self-organization. It's just absolutely stunning to watch, day by day. Just people saying, "We need to help. Okay, let's do it." Boom, and people are helping.
Yeah.
Just to talk about again my town, there was news on BBC making the point that my little town of 13,000 people has taken in more refugees than the whole of the UK. Ukrainian refugees.
You said you've taken in how many?
1,300.
1,300. And so that's a town of 13,000, whereas the UK has 52 million people?
Something like that.
And they have not taken in 1,300. There are 1,300, empty government housing units, probably in London right now.
In the borough of Islington.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I'll be in Belfast in, 2 or 3 weeks. For a similar project that we're working on there with different communities. And when I lived in Belfast some 10 years ago at this point, I was astounded by how many apartment buildings just lay empty, because people just didn't have the resources to refurbish them. Something had happened with some of them. For example, there were buildings that had been firebombed during riots and stuff, during the unrest there, and they just never rebuilt them. And it just, it makes you think, it's a couple million to rebuild one of those buildings, which sounds like a lot, if you're broke folks like we are. But if you're a government that controls hundreds of billions of dollars, that couple million, it's kind of a drop in the budget, a drop in the bucket from a budget perspective, in London. And it does make you think, to what extent do we need to kind of balance that and consider, hey, Belfast could use some fresh blood, some fresh thinkers. A lot of the people leaving as refugees from Ukraine, these are highly trained people, particularly in the tech industry. The Ukraine is similar to Poland in this regard, that it's becoming the backyard for the tech industry, because there's a lot of highly trained and very cheap programmers. And these guys they could revitalize certain communities with the startups that they could found, the energy that they could bring, and the jobs that they could fill. From a purely numbers perspective, for London, they should be taking a hell of a lot more than 1,300. They should be asking Poland to send a few. They should really be active, because the potential benefit, not just politically because it makes them look like they're finally doing something, but just economically, could be inarguably a good idea.
It sounds to me like giving economic reasons to be a good lefty.
It's funny. Libertarianism has an effect on you sometimes.
All right then. I'm gonna end the stream.
Another good hour.
Another good hour.
So it's over. We just finished it. We missed a freak.
All right, we out.
Cryptocurrency.
Bye, everybody.
That's right. I think.
Before you